she rose from the shadows of the court, to capture a king's heart only, to lose her head to his crown. Anne Boleyn didn't come into the world with a crown on her head, or armies at her feet, born around 1501, likely at Blickling Hall or Here Castle. She was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noble woman with powerful family ties. In the grand scheme of Tudor society, Anne's birth barely stirred a ripple, yet from these modest beginnings, something extraordinary was taking root, a life that would one day tilt the course of English history from an early age. Anne was set apart, not by her wealth, but by her mind. She was clever-spirited, and by all accounts magnetic. Recognizing her potential, her family sent her abroad to the continent, where her education truly began. First she served Margaret of Austria in the glittering court of the Netherlands. An experienced few English girls could dream of there, and absorbed the art of diplomacy, refined manners, and the subtle dance of European politics. But it was in France that Anne's brilliance was truly polished. She spent years in the sophisticated courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, learning the language of influence, elegance, flirtation, wit, while other young women perfected their embroidery. Anne mastered conversation, intrigue, and the art of commanding attention without ever seeming to seek it. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, Anne was something rare, a woman who could rival the sophistication of continental courtiers while carrying the ambition of a rising English house. She was unto classic beauty. Even her admirers admitted as much, but she was arresting dark eyes that sparked with intelligence, a quick musical voice, a way of moving that suggested purpose just barely concealed beneath layers of courtly grace, and didn't just enter rooms, she changed their gravity at a time when a woman's fate was often sealed by birth and marriage, and refused to drift quietly into obscurity. She had seen the power that charm and intellect could wield in foreign courts, and she intended to use that knowledge at home. Anne Boleyn was still a young woman, then clever, ambitious, untested, but history was already beginning to stir around her. The girl who returned to England was no longer just Thomas Boleyn's daughter. She was a player in a larger game, one that would soon engulf the crown itself. When Anne Boleyn returned to the English court, she was unlike anyone the nobility had ever seen. In a world full of pale-faced, modest English roses, Anne was a thunderstorm, electric, unpredictable, impossible to ignore. Her dark hair, bold eyes, and quick, sharp wit set her apart from the gentle, obedient ladies who filled the court of King Henry VIII. At first she played the role expected of her, a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon, but even in the Queen's shadow, Anne's presence flickered like a candle, too bright to snuff out. She danced gracefully, spoke French with the ease of a native, and laughed with a confidence few women dared display. Men noticed, women gossiped, the court buzzed quietly about the striking Boleyn girl. It wasn't long before she caught the most dangerous attention of all, the king himself. Henry VIII was no stranger to flirtation. His court was a playground of whispered promises and secret liaison, but Anne was different. She didn't swoon at his compliments or fall eagerly into his arms. Like so many others, had she teased, she challenged, she refused. Henry, a man used to instant adoration, was captivated. The more Anne held him at arm's length, the deeper he fell. Letters passed between them, filled with declarations of love, frustration, longing. Henry offered her the role of royal mistress, the most powerful unofficial position at court, and astonishingly said, no, she would not be just another conquest, a forgotten mistress lost to time. If Henry wanted her, he would have to make her his wife. It was a gamble so audacious that it stunned the court. After all, the king was already married his queen. Catherine was beloved by the people and fiercely protected by her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. The church itself would have to be defied for Henry to claim Anne. But Anne didn't flinch. She had lived in the courts of Europe, where queens wielded soft power from behind lace fans and painted smiles. She knew ambition was a dangerous game. But it was a game she intended to win. Standing in the candlelit halls of the English court, Anne Boleyn made her choice not to be merely admired but to change her destiny and England's forever. What began as an intense flirtation between King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn soon spiraled into a national crisis. Henry wasn't merely besotted, he was obsessed. And in his obsession, he was willing to tear apart everything England had known for centuries. The king's desire to marry Anne hit a small snag, namely, he was already married to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine, dignified and resilient, refused to quietly step aside. She had been Henry's faithful wife for 2 decades, and in the eyes of God and the English people she was the rightful queen. Divorce wasn't just scandalous, it was almost unthinkable, but Henry was determined. He convinced himself, and tried to convince everyone else, that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, because she had once been married to his brother Arthur. Never mind that the Pope had granted special permission for their union years ago. Henry now insisted that his soul was damned unless he annulled the marriage, and I heard part knew better than to appear too eager. She kept herself just out of reach, alternately encouraging Henry's hopes and maintaining her distance. Every glance, every word was measured. She wasn't merely aiming for marriage, she was positioning herself to become Queen of England. The court erupted into whispers and factions. Some noble families eagerly courted Anne's favor, seeing the winds of power shifting. Others clung fiercely to Queen Catherine, horrified at the idea of Anne replacing her. Diplomats wrote desperate letters back to Rome. Foreign monarchs threatened retaliation. Henry's own advisers shifted uneasily, sensing the ground trembling beneath their feet. As months turned into years, Henry's frustration grew. He bombarded the Pope with petitions, maneuvered his lawyers into finding loopholes, and slowly began to realize that the Church would not bend easily. Catherine had powerful allies, including her nephew, Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe. Still, Henry pressed on, defying advice, tradition, and increasingly the law itself. His courtship with Anne had become something far greater than personal desire. It was now a challenge to the very structure of England's political and religious life. Anne wasn't just capturing a king's heart, she was dragging an entire kingdom into uncharted waters. A dangerous game had begun, and there could be no turning back. After nearly 7 agonizing years of maneuvering, scandal, and diplomatic chaos, Anne Boleyn's gamble paid off. In January 1533, she secretly married Henry. A bold move, given that he was still technically married to Catherine of Aragon. In the eyes of the Pope and much of Europe, by June Anne was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It should have been the crowning moment of her life, but the atmosphere was far from universally joyful. The people of London watched with weary eyes. Some cheered, others muttered prayers for Queen Catherine. Many wondered if this new queen, with her French manners and daring spirit, was a blessing or a curse, and entered her queenship not as a beloved figure but as a storm. Unlike Catherine, who embodied traditional English values of humility and piety, Anne was dazzling, provocative, and politically savvy. She wore bold colors, commanded the court with sharp intelligence, and made powerful enemies with breathtaking speed. Her position, while seemingly secure, was also terrifyingly precarious. Everything rested on one thing: providing Henry with a male heir, and knew this as keenly as anyone. She was not merely Henry's lover anymore. She was the hope of a dynasty. Early in her pregnancy, Anne and Henry were elated, certain the child would be a boy. But in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. To Anne's credit, she masked her crushing disappointment with grace, insisting the next child would surely be a son. Henry, however, was less composed. His eyes, once full of adoration, now flickered with doubt. Still, for a time, Anne's star burned brightly. She reshaped the English court in her image, elevating her family to unprecedented heights and becoming the first queen in English history crowned with the sacred oil. Usually reserved for kings, her influence was vast. Foreign ambassadors sought her favor, couriers reshuffled alliances to be in her good graces. The once obedient Henry began moving England officially away from Rome, creating the Church of England with himself at its head, all so that Anne's crown could not be questioned. Yet, even in her triumph, dark clouds gathered. Friends whispered behind their hands. Rivals circled, waiting, and Henry, fickle and restless, was already beginning to look beyond the brilliant woman who had rewritten the kingdom for him. Anne had won the throne, but keeping it would demand more than charm, ambition, or even love. Anne Boleyn had climbed higher than almost any woman of her time, but the higher you rise, the harder the fall. Almost from the moment she placed the crown on her head, the cracks in her world began to show. At the heart of Anne's struggles was the pressure to produce a male heir. Her first child, Elizabeth, though bright and healthy, was not the son Henry V had hung his dynastic hopes upon, and the clock was ticking. And suffered multiple pregnancies in quick succession, but heartbreak followed, miscarriages that left her physically weakened and emotionally battered. Each lost child chipped away at the foundation she had built. Henry, once passionately devoted, began to pull away, his disappointment carving rifts between them. Anne, never one to suffer in silence, argued, demanded, fought to keep her place. But Henry, a man who prized obedience as much as beauty, grew tired of her sharpness, her defiance, the very fire that had once drawn him in. Outside the royal chamber's enemies were gathering like wolves. Many nobles who had tolerated Anne's rise with gritted teeth now openly schemed for her downfall. Catherine of Aragon's supporters never forgave Anne for what they saw as theft and sacrilege. Even commoners whispered against her, calling her the Great, blaming her for the schism with Rome and the heavy-handed changes that followed. And then came Jane Seymour, quiet, demure, everything Anne was not. Jane captured Henry's wandering attention just as Anne's influence began to wane. Where Anne had dazzled him with brilliance and challenged, Jane offered soothing compliance. It was a dangerous shift, and Anne, perceptive as ever, saw it happening. She tried to reclaim her position, lavishing attention on Henry, promising more sons, begging for patience. But the king, ever fickle, had already begun imagining life without the woman for whom he had once torn a kingdom apart. Anne's political enemies, including Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, sensed the changing tide. They began laying the groundwork for a campaign of destruction, quietly gathering accusations, rumors, and witnesses. The woman who had played the dangerous game of ambition so masterfully was now losing ground, and had won her crown through cunning and courage. But in the brutal, shifting world of Henry's court, past victories meant little. Only fresh success mattered. Anne's enemies were sharpening their knives. The queen who had shattered a kingdom would soon see how quickly a kingdom could shatter her. Anne Boleyn's enemies didn't attack her with armies or swords. They came with whispers, secrets, and carefully sharpened lies. In the back rooms of court, betrayal was brewing. Silent, patient, deadly Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's greatest ally in the English Reformation, had turned against her. Their alliance had been built on mutual ambition, but now their interests clashed. Anne wanted reforms to help the poor and limit the power of greedy nobles. Cromwell wanted stability, favour with Henry, and no interference. Anne's boldness had made her dangerous, and in Henry's fickle heart, love had curdled into irritation, suspicion, and cold detachment. Anne had few true friends left. Even her charm, once her greatest weapon, now grated against the court's hunger for a gentler, more pliable queen, and Jane Seymour, quiet and calculating, waited just out of sight, the perfect contrast to Anne's fading fire. It was Cromwell who moved first, knowing Henry was restless, knowing that the king wanted an exit, but lacked a convenient excuse. Cromwell offered a solution. What if Anne could be removed, not by divorce, which would humiliate Henry, but by disgrace? The accusations were wild, monstrous, even adultery against the king. Anne, the proud, brilliant queen, painted as a betrayer, a temptress, a threat to the very crown she once redefined. Cromwell carefully gathered evidence, coaxing confessions under torture, twisting courtly flirtations into damning testimony. Several men, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, were arrested. The charges made little sense. They were riddled with contradictions and impossibilities, but in Henry's court, truth was whatever the king needed it to be. And sensing the tightening noose, fought desperately. She appealed to Henry's memory, to the love they had once shared, but it was no use. The man who had once torn England apart for her now refused to meet her eyes. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. As the great gate slammed shut behind her, she knew the truth. She was no longer a queen. She was a prisoner, a pawn trapped in the brutal game she had once played so masterfully. Betrayal had sealed her fate, and now, alone in the tower, Anne Boleyn waited for the final move. Anne Boleyn stood in the great hall of the Tower of London, facing a tribunal of nobles, many of whom owed their very titles and fortunes to her rise. Now they sat in judgment, cold and watchful, prepared to erase the woman who had once changed the destiny of England. The charges against her were shocking: adultery with multiple men, including her own brother George Boleyn, high treason, conspiracy against the king in another world. Such accusations against a queen would have been unthinkable. But here now they were simply theatre, a grim performance, designed to give Henry VII exactly what he wanted: Anne's downfall, wrapped in a thin veil of legality. Anne defended herself with the same fire that had once won Henry's heart. She denied every accusation with intelligence, precision, and an unwavering composure that astonished even her enemies. She reminded them that she had been crowned with sacred oil, chosen by God and anointed as Queen of England. She reminded them of her loyalty, her sacrifices, her love, but it was all for nothing. The verdict had been decided long before Anne set foot in the courtroom. The trial was a spectacle for the court and for the people, a public unmaking of a once unbreakable woman. Witness after witness, many coerced or bribed, spoke damning words. Dates and places contradicted each other. Evidence was flimsy when it existed at all, but the truth was irrelevant now. Anne was found guilty. Her brother, George, and the other men accused with her were sentenced to death as well. Anne would be executed by beheading, a merciful sentence compared to the usual traitor's death of hanging, drawing, and quartering. When the verdict was read and did not break, she stood tall, her face pale, but her spirit fiercely intact. In those final moments, before being led back to her cell, she spoke, clearly declaring that she was prepared to die, and prayed that God would have mercy on her soul. As the heavy doors of the hall closed behind her, the court exhaled in relief. The storm Anne had been brilliant, dangerous, unforgettable, was nearly over, but even then they did not understand. They were not erasing Anne Boleyn, they were immortalizing her. In betrayal, in tragedy, and in legend. After her trial, Anne Boleyn was returned to the Tower of London, not as the triumphant queen who had once commanded England, but as a condemned prisoner awaiting death, yet even facing the end. Anne refused to crumble in the cold, echoing halls of the tower. Anne prepared herself. She spent hours in prayer, kneeling on the hard stone floors, her hands clasped tightly, her voice steady. She confessed to no crimes because she believed she had committed none. She was not afraid to die, she said, but she prayed that her death would bring peace to the kingdom, and, perhaps, mercy to her little daughter, Elizabeth. Her ladies-in-waiting, those few who had stayed loyal, wept in private. Anne comforted them. Instead of the other way around, she joked bitterly at times that she would be remembered as a queen who had lost her head. In her dark humor was the stubborn spark that had made her unforgettable. Henry, meanwhile, showed no sign of mercy. He had already turned his attention to Jane Seymour even before Anne's execution date was finalized. Henry was arranging his next marriage for Anne. This final betrayal from the man who had once torn down a kingdom for her must have been the deepest cut. On May 18, 1536, Anne was told she would die the next morning. She slept little that night. Instead, she spent her final hours in prayer, asking God for forgiveness for all who had wronged her, and perhaps for herself, for the ambition and pride that had led her here. Henry, with a flicker of royal kindness, had arranged for a French swordsman to carry out the execution. Faster, cleaner, less brutal than an axe. It was a small mercy, bought perhaps more for the king's conscience than for Anne's comfort at dawn. Anne dressed carefully for her final moment, a dark grey gown of damask trimmed with fur, a crimson skirt. Beneath colors of dignity, of sacrifice, she pinned up her dark hair and tucked it beneath a simple cap, ready to face the blade with grace as the tower's cold morning mist curled around the courtyard stones. Anne Boleyn, Queen Mother, survivor, fighter, stepped forward. There would be no tears, no pleas, only a final act of courage in the face of history's judgment. Her end was near. But her story was just beginning. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn ascended the scaffold built within the Tower of London's walls. A small crowd gathered, courtiers, guards, a few witnesses, all wrapped in silence, as if even the stone walls held their breath. Anne stood tall, her grey gown fluttering slightly in the cold morning breeze. She looked thinner than she had at court, her face pale but calm. There were no hysterics, no broken sobs. If anything, she faced death with the same fierce dignity that had once shaken a kingdom to its knees. She spoke, briefly, carefully choosing her final words. She did not accuse. She did not defend herself. She prayed for the king's health and prosperity, the very man who had abandoned her in those final moments, and offered the world not a confession but forgiveness. Her courage stunned even those who had come to see her fall. The French executioner, brought specially to ensure a swift death, stepped forward and knelt upright, her hands folded in prayer, her eyes lifted toward the heavens. A small white cloth was tied around her eyes. She remained still. The sword flashed once, silent, swift, and Anne Boleyn, Queen Mother, history maker, was no more. She was buried quickly in an unmarked grave within the tower grounds, laid to rest in an arrow chest, because no proper coffin had been prepared for her, a queen once crowned in gold, now left to vanish without ceremony. Yet Anne's story didn't end in that cold grave. Her daughter, Elizabeth, the child whose birth had once disappointed a king, would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, whose reign would see the flowering of English art, power, and global influence. A queen who inherited her mother's fierce spirit, sharp mind, and unyielding resilience. And Anne Boleyn changed the course of England forever. Her ambition helped trigger the break with Rome and the birth of the Church of England. Her fall showed the world that even queens could be cast aside, yet through her, blood through Elizabeth Anne's legacy blazed brighter than any crown she had worn in life. In the end, Anne Boleyn won a kind of immortality, not through her survival, but through her indelible impact on history.